Hey everybody, it's Aaron Gore from Arrived. I would like to apologize for being a little late. I'd like to apologize again for having to reschedule on doing this webinar in the first place. I've been having technical difficulties out the wazoo. Uh, Everything that you can imagine has gone wrong, including my house flooding. So thank you so much for being patient. Thank you so much for still tuning in. Hopefully we're going to cover a lot of stuff that's going to be useful to folks, but let's go ahead and dive right in. So today we're going to be talking about level up using data to maximize your taproom success. We're going to be covering all the ways that you're able to use the data you already have access to make your taproom as successful as possible. But I know there's probably a few people out there who are asking, who is this guy and why should I care? And well, thankfully, I happen to have a slide for that. My name is Aaron Gore, Director of Partnerships and Community for Arryved. I've been in the beer industry almost my entire adult life, and prior to Arryved, I was actually a consultant for the majority of my career in the operations side. So at this point, I've done just about everything there is to do in the brewing industry other than brew the beer myself. I've technically brewed 2 commercial batches. Dirty little secret is absolutely nobody wants me doing a third, me included. I'm terrible at it. Not a good brewer, but it does mean that I've been fortunate enough to work with nearly 70 breweries across 3 continents in all different stages of development and all different scales. And that's given me the opportunity to see this industry from a whole lot of different angles. See the things that a lot of breweries are doing that have been very successful, but also see a lot of the challenges that they face and a lot of the opportunities that they've been missing. And one of the opportunities that time and time again I came across is that a lot of breweries simply aren't using data to help them make decisions and help them run their business. And usually that's for one of 2 reasons. The first reason is pretty straightforward, even understandable, very sympathetic. It's people who just don't really feel like they have an understanding of what to do with data, how to access it, how to use it. They just don't feel equipped to actually get utility out of that. And we're going to cover why that's not necessarily the case. And it's a whole lot easier than you think it is. But the other reason is a little more insidious. And I don't mean that in a malicious sense. I just mean that in the sense that it's a lot more damaging to their companies. And it's coming from a place that should be easy to fix, but isn't necessarily. And that's the folks who feel like, they don't need data. What is data going to tell them that they don't know about their business already? Because at the end of the day, who's closer to their business than they are? Who understands their business as well as they do? Nobody. So why do they need data? It's just one more thing to have to deal with. And I can understand where they're coming from. But by the same token, that means that at the end of the day, they're really making decisions with their gut. That's what it means when you're making decisions in an absence of data, because no matter how much experience you have, no matter how much context you have within your own business, how much time in you have within your own business, you're still prey to all of the same biases, all of the same lack of information, all of the same assumptions that any of us would be in any sort of decision-making process. Data is not that. Data, simply put, is just a way of getting to the truth. Now truth can mean many things. You can have bad data that can lead you the other direction, but good data is all about figuring out exactly where you are, because when you're making decisions with your gut, you're the one who has to eat the consequences. You're the one who has to stomach the mistakes and deal with them. And, that's something that can be very difficult in small business because you don't have a lot of room to make those mistakes that are easily avoidable. Now, the most important thing about data is it also helps you figure out exactly where you are, and you can't get to where you want your business to go without understanding where you are. I think most of us that are watching today are old enough to remember what we used to do in an era before ubiquitous GPS on our phones if we were trying to get somewhere. We'd go online, we'd print out MapQuest directions, or we'd sit down and we'd map everything out on a map. The problem there is that's a very good way of getting from point A to point B, till the data changes. Say you take the wrong left, or a road's closed and there's a non-obvious detour. All of a sudden those directions that you had, those assumptions that you had, don't necessarily hold true anymore. And that made it very, very difficult to get where you needed to go. Good data lets you know where you are. That way you can figure that path out again. Also helps you understand what's actually happening in your business. A lot of times the things that we think are making the biggest impact on our bottom line, making the biggest impact on our own success, aren't necessarily the things that we think they are. When you're able to actually get all that information in one place, not only are you able to get a much better, more clear picture of what's happening with your business, but you might be able to see opportunities or risks that otherwise you're not going to be able to see if you're taking all of these things individually. You have to be able to see how these things connect. And sometimes it's in ways that aren't particularly obvious until it's all in one place. And that's important for a couple of reasons, but first and foremost, it lets you be more proactive instead of reactive when it comes to your decision making. Whack-a-mole is a fun game when you're at Chuck E. Cheese and you're six. It's a lot less fun when you're trying to run a small brewery. Being able to attack problems and be able to direct your approach to get you where you want to be instead of taking these problems as they come and hoping that you can see them coming in time. That's absolutely huge for being able to be effective in your business. And this is especially critical in the tap room because at the end of the day, the tap room for 84% of breweries is your number one profit generating part of the business. That is the business, and that number has continued to go up. Even more so now that food has proven itself to be so important. So this is something that you have to get right. But you don't have to worry about, do you have the information? Do you have the data? Because you have more data than you realize right there in your point of sale. We're going to focus on the point of sale. If you're using other software like brewery management software, CRM, those are probably going to give you an enormous amount of data to work with as well. But we're gonna tighten our focus right here and just focus on point of sale. I am going to be using some Arryved reports to set some examples for some of the ways that you're able to use data, but any point of sale, any good point of sale system that you're using should have all the information that we're going to talk about. We want this to be usable for everybody. We want your businesses to be as successful as possible. And if your point of sale does not have this information, this really is stuff that you need to be able to run your business. So it's something you need to keep in mind for the future, whether it's with us or with somebody else. And I know the last pushback, and we'll get back to the folks who, think they're not really equipped to deal with data. Uh, it's not linear regressions and p-values and all the other things that you fell asleep to during high school statistics class. I know that's where your head's at. That's what you think of when you think of data, but that's not this at all. All we're really talking about is being able to look at information and find actual meaning and actual direction and actual opportunity out of it. And that's something that everybody is equipped to do. But what are some of the actual ways that you can use data in your tap room, and not just in your tap room, but in other areas of your business? So we're going to go over some of those different areas, but we aren't just going to go over them one by one. We're also going to go ahead and look at some examples, ways that you can actually put this into practice or really show you what I'm talking about. But the first one that we're going to dive into is going to be one of the ways that most people are already using their point of sale data, at least to a degree, and that's just going to be tracking your sales. At its absolute highest level, that just means, taking a look at what's been your top sellers, what's been moving the best, and what has been moving the worst. Just really getting an assessment of what you're actually selling and in what volumes. And that's important. You need to know that. You need to know what you're selling the most of. You need to know what your number one beer is, at least in terms of total volume. You need to know if you have something that's just absolutely sitting there and not resonating with your customers. That's key, but that's not everything. Revenue is wonderful. It's great. I love being able to sell people stuff, but at the end of the day, you don't put revenue into the bank, you put margin into the bank. And you can't figure out margin without having a good understanding of your costs of goods sold, your COGS, the actual costs of the products that are going out. And that's another thing that your point of sale should be able to provide you with the information for. And it's something you should very much be tracking, whether it's on the food side or on the beverage side, because those costs are absolutely huge when it comes to figuring out what you're actually going to be taking in, how quick you're seeing a return on your investment, and what's actually making the biggest impact for your business, as we'll see here in a minute. Anecdotally, one of my clients back when I was consulting, and I'll never forget this, they were doing $4.5 million in distributed revenue. Pretty impressive number. They were absolutely crushing it throughout the state, but they were absolutely broke. And they wanted to figure out why. Those are the kind of numbers where you should be feeling pretty good, feeling pretty confident. And when we sat down and broke it down, we figured out that they're actually miscalculating their COGS. And when we actually took what their costs were, they were losing $1.74 on every single case that went out of the SKU that made up 47% of all of their total sales. That is just absolutely devastating to find out that you're winning yourselves to death. So track your COGS and keep an eye on what your actual costs are, because that tells you what the actual impact on your business is. It's also a great way of discovering trends, things that you might not see necessarily if you're just looking at each beer individually, being able to figure out if there's some real commonalities among the beers that are resonating the most with your customers, whether that's a branding commonality, whether it's a style commonality, a flavor profile. Those are ways to really figure out what your customers are doing behaviorally. Might even be a time of day thing. Maybe if you have a full liquor program, you're seeing cocktails spike after 10 p.m. Maybe you're just seeing them make up a greater percentage because your beer's starting to drop, but that's something that you need to know and something that you can respond to. It's also why it's important to track time of day, not just day of the week. It's good to be able to figure out what you're doing on Mondays versus what you're doing on Sundays. But more importantly, it's important to track what your employees are doing, but also figure out what's happening hour by hour because you might be open 1 hour more than you need to be. It might not be profitable for one additional hour, either late in the evening or in the morning, or it might be the opposite. You find that you're doing gangbusters the moment you open the door every Saturday. So maybe it makes sense to be open an hour before that and have people come in a little earlier and capture a little more of that revenue. These are things that you need to be able to get that granular with because it can help you make decisions for your business. And then last on this one, just keep an eye out for any sort of loss and spillage. This isn't to say that no bartender should be ever giving away pints of beer, and any good bartender is going to be giving away the occasional beer, but you need to be able to track that. And that's why it's important to also be able to track what you're serving down to the ounce so you understand if that beer is going missing. It's wonderful to say that you serve 20 pints. It's a lot better to be able to say if you have 16-ounce pours, 10-ounce pours, and flight sizes as well as sample sizes, you can actually figure out exactly how much went out. So I know that a half barrel has 1,984 fluid ounces of beer in it, and you know that as well. And we also both know that we're never going to sell that exact amount because you'll have foam over and spillage and all sorts of things. But if you only sold 1,100 ounces of it, and they kick that half barrel, there's a question that needs answered. That's money that you are out. That's costs that you are out. And that's something that you need to be tracking because it might also be sales that you're just not capturing. And it's not just for the tap room itself, even for your back of house, even for your actual production side of the business, it's important to know what your tap room is doing and in what quantities and in what mix, because at the end of the day, they're going to be your most important customer. They're either going to be the number one profit generating part of your business, or they are going to be your single most important customer. Even for a lot of larger breweries, that distribution does bring in more total volume. It's spread out among multiple wholesalers in multiple regions. It's a lot more diffuse, whereas what you're doing in that tap room is going to capture that larger margin on a volume to volume basis. You need to understand what they're doing and take that into account when you're doing any of your planning beyond that for what you're actually going to be producing. That also goes into your splits. You need to know what you're going to do as far as half barrels, sixels, and packaged product, just to be able to make sure that that balance is correct based on what you're predicting for your forecast. And that's important. We need to forecast. As an industry, that's an area that we do not excel in. We're pretty terrible about actually trying to figure out how much we need to sell. Said way too often, we throw 30 barrels of beer in a tank and then say, oh man, hope to God I can move all of that. And then it sits in the back of the warehouse. You code out on half of it, try to fire sale it through the tap room, undermine sales of everything else. And boom, there you go. You've actually almost lost money on that entire batch. We need to be forecasting, but we can't do that without good data around what we are actually selling, how often, and in what volumes and in what formats. So make sure you keep your inventory as slim as possible by keeping track of what you're actually moving. Also helps you find out what kind of products you should be making. We don't want to give carte blanche to our production side and our brewers to make whatever they want without any sort of balance on it. The same that we don't want to give sales or marketing that same level of power. Everyone needs to have input into the beer that's coming out because it needs to be sold and it needs to be oriented towards your audience. Being able to look at what you're actually selling through the tap room helps you figure out the kinds of products and the kinds of opportunities you may have to tailor your production in more effective, more efficient, or maybe even just more novel ways. And then it also helps you really figure out the pricing side. Now, pricing is a little bit, the production planning, but it's also the sales side, and pricing is important. At the end of the day, pricing is one of the most important things when it comes to what people are buying. And if you notice that every time you price an IPA over $7, its sales absolutely crater, that's feedback. That's messaging that you can use to figure out what the optimal strategy is going to be for your business. And it could go the opposite way as well. You can notice that as you drop your imperial stouts below $6, people stop seeing them as premium and they actually stop selling as much because people assume that it's not that good of an imperial stout. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but you're never going to know unless you have that data in front of you. So now, let's take a look at an example. In this case, we're going to be using, it's called the category sales report. This can be found right in Arryved. Most good point of sales are going to have something very, very similar to this, with the exception of that tags column, which we'll get to in a bit. But this is pretty straightforward. So looking at a chart looks intimidating, really not. On the left side, under type, that's just the different beers that this hypothetical brewery has. And the scenario here is we're assuming that this brewery has 6 beers that they serve, or in this case, 5 beers plus a cider. And that for whatever reason, could be anything, draft line could go down, they've just lost a placement, what have you. They're only going to be able to carry 5 of them for a while. They need to figure out which of these 6 products they need to drop off of their menu and drop production of, at least for a while, to have the least impact on their business. So type is just going to be the name of those products: Cascadia West Coast IPA, Blast Off Hazy IPA, Hype Monster, Mosaic and Citra Juicy IPA, Hype Milkster, Citra Mosaic Milkshake IPA, Deschutes Porter, and Vicious Tree Cider. I promise no real beers were harmed in the making of this video. Then you have the quantity. Now we're going to treat all of these as just pints. Nice and easy. So each one of those units under quantity is just going to be 1 full pint of that product. And then go over to gross. That's going to be your total sales. We're also keeping the math simple. We're going to assume every one of these is selling for $6 a pint. So if you look at the Cascadia, you sold 30 at $6. That's going to give you a gross, what you're actually taking in from those sales, of $180. COGS is next to that. That's what it actually costs to make that volume. And then your net, that's your margin. That's what you've actually gained from this transaction, your actual profits. Now, all the way on the right, it's going to be your tags. Now, all this means is big, broad headers of different products. You know, in this industry, we tend to think of styles as being, you know, kind of BJCP guidelines, you know, like we get real granular with it, really strictly defined, but customers don't think like that at all. Most customers don't care that much at all. They think in broad buckets. So if you have a Kolsch and a Czech Pils and a blonde ale on tap, then you see 3 beautiful, perfect, completely distinct and differentiated beers on there. Customers see 3 of the same damn beer. It's just reality. I don't have to like it any more than you like it, but it's something that you got to keep in mind. And in general, it's important to understand the common points and the differing points between everything that you have on offer, because that helps you with seeing some of the trends and some of the ways that your customers are seeing your menu and responding to it. So in this particular example, we're going to go ahead and take a look at these products because we have a few things that jump out of us when it comes to what to eliminate. Now, we're going to leave that Vicious Tree Cider on there because I think we can all acknowledge that if you take that off, you're losing all the cider drinkers. And even if it's the lowest selling of all of these, you know, you don't want to lose that purely incremental business by sending them elsewhere. They're not going to show up in any groups that they're in that there's a person who only drinks cider. You're going to miss out completely if you don't have something for them. Now, the remaining products, this actually looks like it's pretty straightforward. You know, you're only pulling in $120 off of 20 units of Deschutes Porter. It's the lowest of any of them. Go ahead and drop that. It seems so simple. It seems so obvious. Well, hold on a minute. Now, if you take a look at that COGS column, and again, these numbers are fudged. They're made up for purposes of example, but you know, we know IPAs are very, very expensive to make, and a traditional porter, even though specialty malt has gone up in recent years, it's not nearly so pricey to make as a hazy IPA, for example. And that's reflected here. So even though you're selling more of all the IPAs, when it comes to the actual net profit you're bringing in, only that Cascadia at literally half again as many pints sold is bringing in as much profit as the Deschutes Porter. And that's important to keep in mind because that Hype Milkster, yes, it's selling 5 more pints at a time, but it's only bringing in $30 of real profit instead of $70 of real profit like the Porter. And it even gets worse because at the end of the day, you have 2 beers on here between the Hype Monster and a Hype Milkster that are very, very similar. Now, if you eliminated one of those, chances are good that customers who are going to order the other one would just migrate on over. You know, you're not necessarily going to lose much in the way of sales. Whereas if you eliminate that porter, you might be losing dark beer drinkers entirely. It's important to be able to really take a look at the trade-offs and what people are going to be transitioning from if you eliminate any of these options. You get rid of a West Coast IPA, maybe they're not moving to a hazy IPA, maybe they are, but if you get rid of one of your hazy IPAs, will that cost you total sales or just spread those total sales across two instead of three? Now, you don't know. That's something that you can play around with and see by taking one or two off strategically for periods of time and seeing how that affects your total sales. But here, it's pretty obvious that even though you're selling less of the porter, it's going to be a much better option to leave on than that hype milkster is. And chances are good those 25 pints are just going to migrate to the other two hazy IPAs that you have on. Things that you're not necessarily going to be able to get if you don't have all the data in front of you. But it's not just sales, it's not just production that you can use your data for, it's also marketing. Pardon. So there's a famous phrase in marketing that, 50% of my marketing budget is waste of money. I just don't know which 50%. And, to a degree, that's true. Attribution is very hard in marketing because if you were handing out flyers at a farmer's market 6 months ago and it just got in front of somebody that was the first time they'd heard of you, and then it's 6 months later and they're thinking, man, you know what? I do feel like an IPA. And that's why they decide to go seek you out, just because they hadn't wanted one until then. That's a real hard thing to tie back directly to marketing, even though they're responsible for the sale. But there, more than ever, really are ways that you can start tracking some of the efficacy of this and really find out what's working the best for you. So if you're using social media, I hope most of you are, to promote your businesses. We live in a charmed time where being able to speak directly to your customers is cheaper and more accessible than ever. Noisier, but cheaper and more accessible. Meta has an enormous amount of data at your disposal to really feel out what's getting to people, what the impressions are, what's the click-throughs, how often are people actually not just looking at your ad, but stopping on it and engaging with it. That is huge feedback. Use that. But even in your taproom itself, there's feedback that you can get about some of your campaigns. One of the biggest ones is actually going to be discounts. So discounts are a classic part of trying to sell any sort of product. Being able to give people a little more for a little less. It's a great way of getting them to try something or spend a little more when they might not be spending anything at all. But it's hard to know if you're giving something away for cheaper, or if you are selling them something that otherwise they were not going to buy. So at least you're capturing something as an alternative. Being able to take a look at the difference in sales in a given product versus what you'd expect on a given day versus what happens when you're offering the discount, it's a great way of being able to track that. A lot of points of sales can also track the use of whether it's discount codes or coupons, anything along those lines. And that's a fantastic way of getting that feedback as well. It's also great to be able to really experiment with different approaches and see what's going to be working best. And the only way that you're really able to see that is by taking a look at the difference between the way that those products are performing when you're running one sort of promotion or another. If you're running an event, being able to see the total number of customers versus what you'd expect on that night. I had another client who was spending $350 every Friday on live music. Not a crazy amount. They're in a pretty rural area, so it was definitely a little more expensive. And when I asked them why they were doing that every Friday night, they told me that they had to, because if they didn't run live music, then nobody would come out. Well, I said, how do you know that? I said, well, people come out to the live music. We have people here every Friday. Well, that's wonderful. How do you know that they wouldn't come without it? Well, we did what's called an A/B test, and in traditional marketing, it just means running two different versions of the same message, seeing which is the more effective. But in this case, what we really did was just stop doing live music on the occasional Friday just to see what would happen. And sure enough, they built up enough of a stable audience. It wasn't about the live music at all. People were coming out because they liked the place. They liked the beer. They liked the service. They liked the environment. The live music was nice, but they weren't doing $350 extra worth of marginal business because of it. So they wound up cutting it. I've had other places that were in similar conditions where it turns out, yeah, they really do need to do that. And actually spending a little more on that live music, getting bigger bands made a huge difference as far as the number of people in the door. You really need to be able to trial these things. Use the flexibility that you have in your own tap room, because it really is the most flexible part of your business. You can change pricing. You can change your approach. You can change your events pretty easily, pretty quickly, and test out what's actually working. You got to do that, and you got to take a look at the actual data, the feedback that you're getting from it, in order to really have an understanding of what's going on, not just how it feels, but what's actually being impacted. Help if I could actually skip slides. There we go. So taking a look at discounts. Now, this is an example. Oh, hey, I can do it with the arrow keys. I'm learning things about StreamYard, guys. I'm right here along with you. So this is an example. It should look very familiar of running a discount. In this case, people took the lesson of our last example and said, you know what, that porter has an enormous amount of margin that it can give up. And I'm really trying to pump some sales. This is my most flexible beer. It makes me more money on a per pint basis. But if I'm willing to give up some of that, bring in more people on a Monday night, what if instead of charging $6 for that particular beer, I only charge $3? Half price pints every Monday on Deschutes Porter. And we're going to go ahead and see if that drives more people in the door. Now, that's a perfectly valid discount, perfectly valid campaign to launch. There's nothing wrong with that on the surface, but let's see if it actually worked. So if you look down at the bottom, what you're going to see is that they're selling in this example, and you can see that Deschutes Porter jumped up to 60 total pints sold from the 20 total pints that they sold before. But they're still only selling 165 units. Now, if we scroll back a little bit, you'll see here before, they were only selling 20 Deschutes Porters and still sold 165 units. Now, this is a simplified example, but what you're really seeing here is that the sales of every other beer on there actually went down. This is a phenomenon known as trading down. This means that people see that discount, and yes, they might have preferred a West Coast IPA. Yes, they might have preferred a milkshake IPA, but what they're really seeing is an opportunity to get something that's at least going to scratch their back and do the trick, but at a significantly lower price, half the price in this case, and they're going to jump on that instead, even if it might not be their first pick. Sounds great. If the goal here and the only data point you're looking at is that you sold 3 times as much porter, then you're going to count that discount code as a win, or that promotion rather, as a win. The issue here is that even though it was your highest margin earning beer before, now it's not earning much at all. You cut the amount you're charging for it in half, and that COGS doesn't go down. The costs stay the same. So now it's only netting you $30 on selling 60 units. Not great. Matter of fact, it's so not great that if you look down the lower right, your net margin is only $210 versus $310. You cut your net margin by almost a third by running what on the face of it, if you're only looking at one single data point, only working off of your initial goal, seems like a very successful promotion. You need to be able to look at the whole picture because it really helps you understand what's going on. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to have been the case. You could have looked at this and that was selling 60 and everything else was selling either the same, maybe slightly less, or even maybe slightly more because it got more people in the door. And after they had that half price one, sprung for something additional that otherwise they wouldn't have reached for at all because they got a little more money in their pocket, perhaps, or they just happen to be out on a night they otherwise aren't. You're never going to know this without testing it out and without paying attention to the data you have available. Loyalty programs are also incredibly important. Now, not every point of sale is going to have an integrated loyalty program. We have our insider program. Some others offer either paid or free loyalty programs, and there's some fantastic third-party options as well. But one way or the other, loyalty programs are great because increasingly we are having to compete with a much wider subset of businesses. We're not just competing with other breweries, we're competing with other bars and restaurants. And we're not just competing with other bars and restaurants, we're competing with drinking at home. We're not even just competing with that. We're competing with every other way that people can use their disposable income at a time that a lot of people feel like that disposable income is being pinched. It's important for us to be able to really not just retain and incentivize customers, but be able to understand them better so that we can do a better job of serving their needs, because that's what we're all here to do. This is a hospitality business now, more than it's ever been before. And if I'm presuming everybody who's watching has heard of the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule. It's the idea that 80% of the effects are caused by 20% of the causes. That holds true when it comes to your taproom as well. And there's been some studies that come pretty close to that number, that 20% of your total customers are going to account for nearly 80% of your business. We got a word for those: regulars. When you have regulars, that means that keeping them happy, keeping them satisfied, doing things that incentivize them to come in as often as they can and spend as much as they can is going to have a disproportionately large impact on your bottom line versus trying to appeal to every other one of the 80% of additional customers. So focus on your regulars. Anybody who's ever run a bar or a restaurant can tell you that. They're the ones who keep the lights on. Everything else is bonus. But on top of that, how can you do that off of anything other than just anecdotal, just talking to them, if you don't have a true understanding, a really solid understanding of when they come in, what they're buying, how much they're buying? Can you track if that has changed over time? Can you track what styles, what general types of products that they tend to enjoy the most? Having good loyalty programs in place is a great way of tracking that, and any good one is going to give you some base level information. So for this one, we're not necessarily going to do like a problem example like we did before, but this is going to be something for you to look at. This is the kind of information you should be able to expect out of a good loyalty program. Just make sure you're able to really get a better understanding of your customer, and hopefully can also send specialized discounts, specialized messaging, specialized marketing to them as well. Those are the ways to get them back in the door, because maybe they just got distracted in life. Maybe they forgot how much they loved you. But the people who opt into loyalty programs, they want to hear from you. You're not an annoyance. They did that for a reason. They're engaged. They're invested. They want to hear about what you're going on, your promotions, your events, new products that you have. So tell them, use that information, and do what you can to get them coming in, and let them have the opportunity to enjoy your space as much as they would like to, because they may just not be aware of all the things that they would love about it. And then we get to staffing. Now, this is a key one, because anybody who is running a tap room can tell you that labor is expensive and it's a headache and it's hard to get right. Hiring is hard to get right, but so is even just basic scheduling. It's very easy to over or under schedule, and that can be equally hazardous, because if you over schedule, have too many people, then that's labor costs that you're paying, and it dilutes the tip pool, which frustrates your top performers especially. That's a problem. But under scheduling means that service levels drop, your staff feels stressed out, they feel overworked, and they're not going to be doing all the upselling or the retaining that otherwise they would be doing. So getting that scheduling right and getting it just right is absolutely critical, but also very, very difficult. So using your point of sale to understand what times a day you have peak business, in what volumes, who your top performers are, how much they can handle, because you are going to have some bartenders who can handle a lot more than others. And, yeah, it might be good feedback that you need to start working out some of the underperformers, but it also just might mean that they need more coaching. That's the first step. See if you can turn them into top performers. And for a lot of them, they just need that push. They need that support. They need that guidance. But some of them are just average. And they might not be your top performers, but you need to understand that they're only going to be able to handle 75% of the customers in the door on a Saturday that top performer can, and schedule accordingly. So by having this information and a whole suite of this information, especially if you're also using some additional tools like 7 shifts, scheduling tools to really to support that, that gives you enormous amounts of information that you can use to nail that and get it right. But it's not just about being able to get the scheduling right. Incentive programs are also pretty key. I actually did an entire seminar on just variable compensation programs and how to nail those, how to do it successfully at CBC 2 years ago, and a few other conferences. And being able to use whether it's bonus programs or competitions or commissions to incentivize your staff is huge for a few reasons. First, it increases engagement. Second, it allows them to get paid more at a time where that's increasingly important, especially as we're competing with more traditional bars and restaurants for the same staff, and service staff is hard to come by right now. And it does so in a way that offsets your costs by tying them to things that are actually making more money for the organization, and helps keep everybody on the same goal. But you can't do any of that if you can't track what your employees are actually doing. If you can't track their total packaged product sales, then it's really hard to set some sort of award for hitting a certain level of cases sold. If you're not able to track their total revenue or their average ticket, then it's really hard to be able to provide incentives around that and encouragement around that, because you're really just going off of vibes at that point. You need to be able to attribute that revenue to your employees, or at the very least to individual shifts when a group of people are working. And most important of all, it's also important to be able to make sure that you're not ever missing paying people, or missing the correct amount you should be paying people. If you ever overpaid somebody, it's very, very hard to tell that person that just because you overpaid them, now you're going to have to underpay them the next pay period, because all they saw was money come in and they got bills. They got to pay. If you underpay somebody, much bigger problem. At the end of the day, paying people on time and correctly is absolutely the first thing you should be doing in your business. And I know a lot of people say, well, there's so many other areas that are just as important as people's compensation. Wrong. Don't get me wrong, there's other areas that are incredibly important, but yeah, here's a fun experiment to do. Treat your employees like don't do this, by the way, but treat your employees like an absolute jackass for 2 months, and they'll complain about it. They'll probably hurt morale and engagement. Maybe one or two will leave. uh, Now try not paying them for 2 months. You'll have no more staff. I don't blame them for a second. I wouldn't stay either, because at the end of the day, their bills haven't stopped. You have to make sure that you're paying people accurately, and having good data, accurate data, good punches, having the tip pool calculated correctly. This is all absolutely critical. It's a basic function of your point of sale, and it's also something you should be able to go back and review and have a good understanding of, to ensure that accuracy and help you find maybe service models that are more effective. Does it make sense to have a floater who's just wandering the floor doing table service, or doing bar service make more sense and keep your costs low? Does it make sense to have multiple venues that are all serving at different areas of your bar, or is that just adding an additional person for not much benefit? You need to be able to track the performance by hour and by employee to really have a good understanding there. Now, this is another one we're not necessarily going to do a thought experiment, but I promise the names of all these employees were completely randomized and I have absolutely no connection to anything in the beer industry. But a couple of KPIs that are important to track. Now, the first one is the holy grail, at least in my opinion, and a lot of others, when it comes to the performance of your actual bar staff. Not necessarily your bar, but of your bar staff, and that's going to be average ticket. Now, why average ticket? Why not total sales? Well, at the end of the day, it's not your bar staff's responsibility to get people in the door. That is the management's, that is marketing's, that's your events, that is your location, that is everything but their job. They can't force people to walk in the place. What they can impact is how much people spend once they're in there. Now, they're not going to be able to make that magically happen, but if somebody goes in and they're in a vacuum, talking to a wall, we're going to spend $20, then they should probably be able to get through good service, through strategic upsells. You're talking to them and finding out their needs. You're making them feel comfortable and satisfied in that space. Get them spending 30, 35, a million. The value is arbitrary. The important thing is that average ticket value, that's the real performance. That's the impact they're actually having for your business versus a computer, versus a self-pour station. And most bartenders are so much more valuable than any self-pour station because they do bring value. And that's great because it also means that they can be coached and trained and learn over time to deliver more value. So if you're looking for the best KPI for your bar staff, that is it. Some other good ones there we're tracking: average dollars per hour. That's just giving you an idea of the total amount that they're dealing in a given period. On average drinks per hour. That's giving you a hint of the actual service level, the volume of service in that period. And then you have some of the other ones. These are more like the upsells or the things that aren't necessarily going to their bottom line directly, but are important to track. Things like loyalty signups. It's like I used to work in a TJ Maxx way back in the day, when I was real young. And, one of our big things was signing people up for credit cards. Boy, they incentivized the hell out of us on that. It didn't really impact my day to day and my job, but they really leaned on us to be able to do that because it was huge for the company. They needed to be able to track that. Loyalty signups can be huge for your company, but it doesn't necessarily affect the tip volume. So it's important to be able to track that and maybe even build some incentives around it. Same goes for upsells. Something as simple as, do you want to take anything home with you? Can be a huge game changer. I think there's something like a 90% increase, Andrew actually found, when people just ask that simple question on whether or not people are going to take home a growler 4-pack. That's a major impact on your business because that's just money that's sitting on the table otherwise. That's brand recognition of that sitting in their fridge and then building it into their preferred product and their preferred drink of choice. It's important to be able to take those opportunities. Maybe they don't realize that you sell t-shirts. Maybe they don't realize that beer that they've had 4 pints of in the last hour, that they also, thank God, their friend is driving them home, is also something that you do have 4-packs of, and they can take that with them. The party don't have to stop here. You need to be able to track that as well. It's the only way that you can impact them, because at the end of the day, what gets measured gets managed. But data isn't necessarily perfect. It's not magical. There are hazards to data as well. So some of the ones that you got to keep in mind. Well, the first, this actually comes back to the hypothetical, that excuse I hear a lot of people not using data, that, well, I know my business so well. Well, they're wrong. You still need data, but that doesn't mean that that experience and that intimate knowledge isn't valuable. It's invaluable. It's incredibly valuable, because at the end of the day, one of my favorite quotes is that context is to data like water is to a dolphin. Mostly because it's a ridiculous quote, but it's also true. You have to have context to immerse the data in. Otherwise, it has no utility. You have to understand the real situation to know what you're looking at and be able to contextualize it so you can get actual insights out of it. Data is entirely about trying to find insights, and you have to have that experience, have to have that context to get those insights. It also means that bad data is worse than no data. You have to be able to compare apples to apples and not apples to, I don't know, bicycles. You got to make sure that when you're measuring stuff, you're measuring it consistently. You're using the same units, you're tracking the same things. Otherwise, you might be comparing two things that aren't necessarily equivalent. You can also over extrapolate trends. Now, I think anybody who's in the craft beer industry has noticed that as an industry, we're going through a bit of a how best to phrase this, a doomer period. The sky is falling. It's the end of the absolute universe. But the reason for that isn't necessarily that craft beer is doing so bad. We're still so much larger as an industry than we used to be. It's just we got really accustomed to seeing that line go up, and seeing our market share grow, our industry grow. And it's because for a long time we did see that arrow going up, and it's so easy to over extrapolate and assume it will continue to. But just because something is heading in a given direction does not necessarily mean whatsoever that it will continue to. That is a fallacy. That's basically the same as the gambler's fallacy. You cannot assume that current trends will hold. So be careful. You can use directionality to guide you. You can use historicals to guide you, but don't assume that things cannot change, because sometimes the underlying situation can change as well. Base rate fallacy is another common fallacy, and all this means is keep in mind that percentage change. You have to keep the context of the underlying amount in mind if you're going to be drawing insights out of it. Otherwise, it's definitely an apples to oranges scenario. After all, I don't know if you've heard, but Klingon from Star Trek is the number one fastest growing language in the world, because when you go from 2 people to 3 people, it just grew by 50%. Yeah, doesn't necessarily mean that it's growing more than Spanish, for example. But it's very easy if you're just looking at percentages to draw bad comparisons if you're not aware of the underlying numbers. And then just make sure you test your theories. We talked earlier about the fact that tap rooms are the perfect little laboratory. They move quickly. You can change the price up there, not even for a whole day, and unless that's mandated by law in your state, you can change it by the hour if you need to. Some places are doing, surge pricing, which I hate the name of. All it means is basically demand-driven pricing. But you have the ability to just see what works. Maybe you're trying lowering the pricing at certain times of day. It's all happy hour is, and you can find that actually drives different behavior. Use that opportunity when you can, because that can give you so much more insight into the way that customers are approaching your brand, the things that are actually impacting them, and the things that might work in the future as well, because that's a level of flexibility you do not have in distribution. But that's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for giving this a watch after, almost 2 issues of technical difficulty. We almost weren't able to make it happen today as well. But if anybody is watching, I'll go ahead and open it up for questions now. But other than that, we can go ahead and wrap up. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me, though. I love hearing from people all over the industry. If anybody's going to be at the Virginia Brewers Conference, definitely would love folks to come on by and say hi to me. I'll also be doing a presentation on pricing there. But outside of that, y'all, thank you so much. As always, have a great day.